there is some sort of higher dimensional space. And this is an idea that comes from physics itself, but I, in some sense, think this higher dimensional space can, if you like, accommodate mind. And so, but if that's the case, that will have eventually profound technological implications in terms of, if you like, transdimensional inferences, vacuum energy, all sorts of things. I mean, I can't foresee all the possible implications, but what I bet you is that this paradigm is going to have profound implications, and those implications will not just be on a material level. I think those implications will also be on a mental and even spiritual level, and it can go either way. I think we can already see the dangers when you look at quantum technology, for example, and the developments of computers. We can see both the positive and the negative aspects of that. Maybe we can talk about that later. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that I think this next paradigm, this post-material paradigm, will not only shift our conceptual understanding of the place of humans in the universe, I think it will have profound technical implications which may help to save us.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. Yeah. So what can a cosmologist, a person who has studied with one of the famous cosmologists, Stephen Hawking, at Cambridge University, what can a cosmologist who has studied the first second of the universe tell us about the future of humanity? Now we're going from like the beginning to where. And that will be the focus of our discussion today with Bernard Carr. He's an emeritus professor of mathematics and astronomy at Queen Mary University of London. For his PhD, he studied the first second of the universe at Cambridge University and Caltech with Stephen Hawking. He then held research fellowships at Trinity College, and his professional area of research is cosmology. That's what the whole thing is, the universe, what's going on here, and includes topics, as I've mentioned, the early universe, black holes, dark matter, and the anthropic principle, which is the idea that it's all been done so humanity could be here on Earth. He is also very interested in the role of consciousness, which he regards as fundamental rather than incidental feature of the universe. And he's been president of the Scientific and Medical Network currently, and former president of the Society of Psychical Research. So we have here a gentleman who has studied the universe and also consciousness. And there are not too many people doing that, although there are more, that's increasing. And so we will be talking with Bernard about the future of humanity. He just happens to have come back from Perth, Australia. Just happened a week ago before this recording, at a conference about the future of humanity. And so we're going to see what Bernard has to say about where we're going. So welcome once again to the Connecting with Coincidence, Bernard. So glad to have you back again.
My pleasure, Bernard. Well, you pointed out that my professional field is cosmology. And of course, cosmologists are interested in the largest scales of all. In fact, you can see the image of the universe behind me. Right in the middle, I'm hiding it, is the sun, and then you go out, you see the planets, and then you see the star systems, and then as you go further out, you see the galaxies, and eventually you have the whole universe. And in fact, the little circular boundary represents the edge of the universe, which has been brought into to a finite distance. And so you're correct that as a cosmologist, my interest is really on the largest scales of structure, and indeed on the longest time scales almost conceivable. Well, both the shortest and the longest time scales conceivable, because when we're talking about the history of the universe, we're talking about time scales of tens of billions of years, and we even speculate about time scales much longer than that, 100 billion years. But also, we're interested in the very early Big Bang, where we're interested in time scales of fractions of a second. But both of these are rather remote from human experience. Of course, humans have a much smaller scale in the cosmos, and they only exist for a tiny period. I mean, I think if you were to scale the whole history of the universe to one day, human beings would just have arisen at a few minutes ago or something like that. And of course, our existence is very ephemeral. I mean, we could get wiped out at any moment by all sorts of astrophysical or even human catastrophes. And so you might say, as a cosmologist, I shouldn't be so interested in humanity, because I'm not even, as a cosmologist, I'm not even interested in things on the scale of planets. I'm only interested in things on the scales of galaxies above. But of course, the fact is that I'm not only a cosmologist. I am interested, as you say, in consciousness. And of course, that does involve humanity. And it is interesting because when you contemplate the success of physics in coming to understand the universe, either from on the larger scale of the cosmos or the smaller scale of subatomic particles, it is really a triumph that we have come to understand the universe on all those different scales. But it's a triumph of mindlessness, because the picture of physics we have at the moment doesn't make any reference to the observer. It doesn't make any reference to consciousness and to mind. And so whereas a lot of emphasis is now on mindfulness, the triumph of physics seems to be a triumph of mindlessness. Now, I think that has to be wrong. I think it means that something is missing from our picture of science, and I think therefore there has to be a new scientific paradigm which is going to go beyond the mere material universe and is going to make reference to consciousness. And in fact, I personally believe that there will be a new picture of physics which amalgamates relativity theory and quantum theory. And I believe that that paradigm will explicitly make some reference to consciousness and mind, and maybe even spirit. And of course, that is where humanity comes in. So although on the face of it, you might think that not only to a cosmologist, but even to a physicist, that humanity seems to be rather irrelevant. On the contrary, I think when we have a final picture of physics, or at least some future paradigm of physics, I don't know whether it will be the final theory, I think humanity is going to turn out to play a crucial role.
The logic that you've just presented to us implies the necessity of consciousness, because we're looking at cosmology, we're looking at what the universe has created, however teleologically we might think about that. And part of the creation is the ability of human beings to observe what the cosmos has done. Otherwise, it would be just floating out there doing something, and it wouldn't have any awareness of what that something is and just what it composes. So the logic that you present is the most clear I've heard you say about how we have to have consciousness as part of cosmology.
Yes, I mean, I think they're really different issues. I mean, one issue is consciousness fundamental to the universe, or is it just produced by the brain? Is it purely incidental? It's that, it's the result of the history of the universe has produced complexity, and it's produced brains, which in some sense are the culmination of complexity, and then brains have produced consciousness. And on that perspective, consciousness is really rather incidental. It plays a purely passive role in the universe. The universe carries on operating according to the laws of physics, regardless of whether anybody is actually observing the universe. But I don't think that is the final picture, because I think when you actually look, well, sorry, that's the first issue, whether consciousness is fundamental. The second issue is it going to be part of physics? And of course, it could be fundamental and have nothing to do with physics, because most physicists would take the view that physics is concerned with the third person perspective, and by its very nature can't take into account the first person perspective, in other words, consciousness. Now, I disagree with that. I think that a future paradigm of physics will have to make some reference to consciousness, and that's not a majority view among physicists. It's probably a minority view, but there are a lot of eminent physicists who do share that view. For example, Roger Penrose is someone who has argued that the final theory of physics, quantum gravity or whatever, has to have some link to consciousness. So that's the second issue. And the third issue, I would say, is maybe more controversial. That's to do with whether the consciousness is actually generated by the brain, which is the mainstream view, of course. I'm sure 99% of neuroscientists and maybe 90% of physicists think that consciousness is generated by the brain. I don't take that view. I personally favor the view that consciousness is filtered through the brain.
You've just gone through the logic of other people's thinking, kind of majority of thinking, but let's just recognize they're wrong. That there's more than just being produced by the brain and incidental. There's too much, as you know, from your work with Scientific and Medical Network and the parapsychological organizations you've been part of, that there's more going on, that we are not, our consciousness is not isolated to our brain. And just starting with telepathy as a simple example, knowing somebody's mind at a distance begins to question just what the old paradigm. Now let's just say you've done a wonderful summary of the old way of thinking. It's no longer necessary and no longer correct. Let's just make that assumption for today, because I agree with you. I think many of our viewers agree with you. So let's say consciousness is part of this whole thing. And one of your favorite ideas, and I have had to keep thinking about it, is that the universe has created our consciousness so it can become aware of itself. And that's one of those ideas that is still to be unpacked, and maybe we'll be doing it, but you've mentioned that we are in trouble, that we can get hit by an asteroid, but more likely is that we're going to blow ourselves up in some form or another, that humanity is on a self-destructive path. And my interest in your interests is, what does a cosmologist who knows consciousness is part of this universe that we're in, that it's created whatever the agency is, that consciousness is pervasive around us humans at least?
Well, first of all, let me stress, Bernard, that when I posed those three questions, I was, of course, contrasting the standard old view with my own view, and I hope I made it clear that my own view is, I answered those questions in the way that contrasts with the old view. That's to say, I believe consciousness is fundamental, not incidental.
You've made that clear.
I believe consciousness will be part of physics, and I believe that consciousness isn't generated by the brain. And as you indicate, the evidence for that last statement, I would say, comes from these phenomena like telepathy and various altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences, all those phenomena which mainstream science is rather skeptical of, perhaps, which I think make it clear that consciousness is a non-local phenomenon, not just locked into our brains, that in some sense our consciousnesses are linked together, and that in some sense that our little consciousness with a little c is just a manifestation of consciousness with a big C. So I have the vision, which I think you share, that there is collective consciousness with a big C, which is filtered through the brain or any other system which is complex enough to, well, generate memories and have an internal map and intelligence and things like that. So that's my own particular perspective. And that's where cosmology comes in, because when you talk about how does consciousness come into cosmology, I'm not really talking about how does consciousness with a little c come into cosmology. I'm talking about how consciousness with a big C comes into cosmology. Now, I think even from cosmology, there are indications that consciousness with a big C is important. As you probably know, I've been very interested in what's called the anthropic principle, the
Yes.
so-called fine-tunings between the constants of physics, which seem to be required in order that observers can actually arise in the universe. In other words, in order that the universe, if you like, can become aware of itself. And when I first wrote about this idea with Martin Rees some 45 years ago, that was a rather controversial view. Now I would say that the anthropic arguments are much more acceptable. Not everyone accepts them, but the arguments are no longer taboo. And this is partly because of developments in physics, because of the idea of the multiverse, which we talked about before. But the point is that I think that is the crucial thing, that consciousness it does play an important role.
And the anthropic principle is a remarkable set of coincidences that make it possible for the Goldilocks to be, it's just right for us, that it's just right for us to be here. Change any one of these principles and the whole thing blows up and we're not here. My favorite actually is chlorophyll. Like, where did that come from? And without it, we wouldn't be eating. But there were all kinds of other amazing opportunities provided that allow us to become what we are. Now, I'm going to try to see if it's possible to bring the cosmologist from outer space into a phrase you just used, a collective consciousness. And the collective I'm asking you about is the collective human consciousness. And I don't mean just collective human, I mean collective with nature and a lot of the other consciousness beings that we have around us who also have various forms of consciousness. And it's that collective consciousness of what I call the collective human organism. The collective human organism has a consciousness also. And that consciousness for me is to be invoked, to recognize, be recognized, and used to reverse the trajectory that we have set ourselves on.
Right. Well, in answer to that, Bernard, I'd like to stress something, and that is I refer to consciousness with a big C, which in some sense I was thinking of something to do with cosmology with a big C. And then I also refer to consciousness with a little c, which is the consciousness associated with our individual brains, which, as I say, from my perspective, which are filtering consciousness with a big C. But I would say it's not as simple as that, because I've always argued that actually there's a hierarchy of consciousness. Now, we, of course, not you individually, but human beings tend to think that they're the most important form of consciousness in the universe. But actually, I would argue that we're only a very special form of consciousness. That's to say, all consciousness has what I call a specious presence. It's the sort of minimum time scale of experience, which is about, for human beings, it's about 1/10 of a second. That's to say, you can't ever be aware of anything which is less than 1/10 of a second. If I have a light going around in a circle, if it goes around more than 10 times a second, you don't see motion, you just see it as a continuous circle. And so, in some sense, our consciousness has a minimum time scale, which is roughly 1/10 of a second. And indeed, we can't experience things much longer than that either. For things on a time scale much longer than a memory time scale, we wouldn't perceive as time either. So our consciousness only exists over a very small range of time scales. Now, we tend to assume that that's the only consciousness there is, but I don't think that's true at all. I think there could be consciousness on a vast range of timescales, some which may be much shorter than ours, species present, some which may be much longer. Maybe a computer, for example, has consciousness with a species presence of a nanosecond. Maybe there are galactic civilizations which have consciousness with a species presence of a million years. We wouldn't directly know because we can only communicate with other levels of consciousness. So my view is that consciousness exists over a wide range of timescales. And to assume that humans are the only form of consciousness is incredibly arrogant from my perspective.
Agreed.
Uh,
Agreed. It's
but
no. Go ahead. I have
Well,
one
I
more
was just going to
question.
say, to be more specific, because I'm just trying to relate it to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Part of this hierarchy, you might say, is the individual human. Then there might be a planetary level of consciousness, which would have a much longer species present. I don't know, maybe a day or whatever. And then there might be a stellar level of consciousness. There might be a galactic level of consciousness. There could be a cosmic level of consciousness. So I tend to see consciousness as having a hierarchy. And so it's not just a question of consciousness with a little c versus consciousness with a big C associated with the cosmos. I would say there's a whole hierarchy of consciousnesses, and the next one up might be the planetary level of consciousness. Now, when you talk about humanity and the future of humanity, I think you're really talking about the planetary level of consciousness. Okay, you're not talking about individual consciousness,
No.
but you're talking about planetary level of consciousness. But nor are you talking about the cosmic level of consciousness, the
No.
galactic or the cosmic level.
No.
So that's what I wanted to just clarify, that I think that when you talk about the future of humanity, you're really talking about the future, by definition, of planetary consciousness.
Now let's talk about your shirt for a minute, because that's where that's
Oh,
what
right.
you're wearing that shirt for a good reason. What's that shirt? Help,
Well,
help me.
this I, you will remember. I don't know how many of the viewers remember the film called Help by the Beatles, and these are the images of the Beatles, and that they're spelling out the word help with semaphore. And I thought this was an appropriate shirt to wear. I was a great Beatle fan, but of course I thought this was an appropriate theme for this discussion, because whatever the future of humanity is, and it can clearly go in one of two directions. It can either be
Yes.
glorious, successful, or horrific. I mean, whatever, we're clearly going to need help. So I
Yeah.
just thought this was an appropriate shirt to
And
wear.
I'm looking for you, looking to you for some help here, Bernard. Uh, and Bernard is like, I'm trying to be like calling you in from outer space. Say, Bernard, would you please come down to the surface of this planet that we're sitting on here for a minute, and and help us out here with your cosmological perspectives? And you're starting to get there, but I'm pulling on this rope, trying to say, okay, can we get some help from the Beatle fan that you are? And I am proposing that humanity, just humanity to start with, as part of the concentric circles that you're drawing, that humanity collectively has a consciousness as well. And we can go beyond that to the planet. And the planet, I think I'll call Gaia consciousness, the consciousness of what people might call Mother Nature, and that we are deeply embedded in that Gaia consciousness, I'm suggesting. But I'm also just trying to see how you think about the consciousness of the collective human organism, of humanity itself. And if you think about that, how might that knowledge help us change the trajectory that we are negatively on?
Well, my view, as you know, Bernard, I am a physicist and a cosmologist. And so when thinking about the future of humanity, I, I like to think of that in terms of my experience as a scientist. I mean, obviously, one can consider the problem from a political or a sociological or an anthropomorphic or a religious perspective or whatever, and I'm sure other speakers in this series have done that. But so I think the best I can do is to focus on the question in my scientific capacity by drawing on some of the ideas that you've already referred to. Now, why I think that is important is because I keep referring to the fact that there's going to be this next paradigm. This is going to be a paradigm of physics I'm talking about, but it's also part of a general scientific paradigm. And as I said, my perspective is that this is going to be a marriage of, if you like, quantum theory and relativity theory. These both describe the micro world and the macro world respectively with enormous precision, but we know that they are not compatible. So the final theory of physics, which everybody's looking for, including my supervisor, former supervisor Stephen Hawking, this theory of everything has got to bring those ideas together. And of course, I keep saying this is going to have something to do with consciousness. You could say this is a hope, rather. We don't know that for sure because not all physicists would agree. But when physicists say that, for example, physics can't possibly explain psychic phenomena, for example, because they're not compatible with relativity or quantum theory, that to me that makes no sense at all, because the final theory of physics, we don't have it, but the final theory of physics, which combines quantum theory and relativity theory, who's to say that isn't going to be compatible not only with consciousness, but even with psychic phenomena, which of course are somewhat more controversial than consciousness. At least everybody accepts that consciousness exists, even if they don't believe in psychic phenomena. So that is my dream, that there will be this new paradigm, which in some sense is already, I think, happening. But of course, it doesn't happen overnight. Now, that paradigm is going to be, if you like, a post-materialist paradigm. And I think that post-materialist paradigm, which in some sense is going to be expanding physics to accommodate mind, and not only mind, but also spirit, in my view, that in that paradigm, a crucial role is going to be played by, well, consciousness, mind, and spirit. And from me, that is where, if you like, the hope for humanity comes in. Because it's clear that if you do have a paradigm which is going to accommodate mind and spirit, if you have a paradigm which is going to show that we are actually part of a collective consciousness, let's just say a collective planetary consciousness, we don't have to go straight to the cosmic level, that has got to have implications for the humanity. And for example, if you believe that your consciousness is part of a planetary consciousness, then that means that it changes your view of the meaning of life and the purpose of life. It means you have to, in some sense, you have to develop compassion, because if you relate to all other beings, you feel you're part of a greater identity, a greater consciousness. Clearly, that means you have greater empathy, greater compassion with them, and I think that that will be a crucial. Well, I think that will ultimately be positive in helping humanity survive. But you see, it's not just a question of the actual realizing that we're part of a collective consciousness. I think that will be helpful. It goes beyond that, though, because I mean, whenever you've got a paradigm shift in science, it also has technological aspects. And so when you talk about this post-materialist paradigm, it's going to come along with technological aspects. And so then you've got to ask, well, are those technological aspects going to help save us, save humanity? And I think this is something which maybe doesn't get focused on enough. So it's not just a conceptual idea of some concept, scientific concept, which is going to merge the material and mental world. It's to do, I think, with the sort of technological implications of that paradigm shift. So let me just give some examples. I mean, the history of physics, of course, every development in physics ends up having some profound technological impact on humanity. I mean, we just go back 100 years, the discovery of the electron, when the electron was first discovered, of course, the people said, oh, well, it will never be of any use. But now, of course, the whole of civilization depends on the electron. Then we discovered nuclear forces and things. And of course, well, we all know about the implications of nuclear forces. But the point I want to make is that you always have both positive and negative implications. Whatever the discovery, it's always going to have positive and negative implications. Electrons provide energy and all sorts of other things we require for humanity, also electrocutors. Atomic nuclear forces can provide nuclear energy, but they can provide atom bombs and destroy us. At the moment, we've got all the technology associated with quantum theory. And I hadn't really realized this until I went to this meeting in Perth, which you referred to, which was about basically quantum technology and the future of humanity. Sometimes people think of quantum physics as just, rather elite intellectual pursuit going on with strange implications for the nature of matter. That's not true. It has profound implications for technology and for society. And in fact, quantum theory is a $1 trillion industry. And that's clearly important. Now, I think whatever this new paradigm shift is going to be, I think that will also have technological implications. And I think those technological implications may also be very positive. I mean, they may be positive and they may be negative. For example, my own vision of this new paradigm, as you may know, it's not the standard model of physics, but it involves the idea there is some sort of high-dimensional space. And this is an idea that comes from physics itself, but I, in some sense, think this high-dimensional space can, if you like, accommodate mind. And so, but if that's the case, that will have eventually profound technological implications in terms of, if you like, transdimensional inferences, vacuum energy, all sorts of things. I mean, I can't foresee all the possible implications, but what I bet you is that this paradigm is going to have profound implications, and those implications will not just be on a material level. I think those implications will also be on a mental and even spiritual level, and it can go either way. That could be it could be say the salvation of humanity, or it might be the destruction of humanity. I think we can already see the dangers when you look at quantum technology, for example, and the developments of computers. We can see both the positive and the negative aspects of that. Maybe we can talk about that later. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that I think this next paradigm, this post-material paradigm, will not only shift our conceptual understanding of the place of humans in the universe, I think it will have profound technical implications which may help to save us.
As you talk about so many important things, please distinguish between spiritual and mental.
That's an important point, Bernard, because there, at least in the West, we do make a distinction between mental and spiritual. When I refer to this paradigm shift, it really comes in two stages, I would say. The first paradigm shift, because traditionally people have associated science with the material world. But when I say we're going to expand the paradigm to accommodate mind, it is saying that in some sense we are going beyond pure matter. We're going into this, I call the post-materialist paradigm, in which the approach of science, the way in which you theorize about the nature of reality and you do experiments and try to test it, etc. The process of science is being extended to the world of mind, and that involves consciousness. Now, that view, 20 years ago, that would have been regarded as pretty heretical. Now it's becoming more or less mainstream because of developments in quantum theory, neuroscience, AI, and things like that. The idea that science can be expanded to accommodate mind is becoming more or less mainstream. And although the way in which I envisage a paradigm accommodating mind is not mainstream, I have this view of a sort of higher dimensional space of which physical space is just a sort of lower dimensional slice. Although that's not mainstream, I think the general idea that you can have a paradigm of physics, if you like, which will accommodate mind, is becoming more acceptable now, with people like Roger Penrose, for example, push that. However, it's important to stress that that's the first step. And just accommodating mind. Accommodating spirit, that's one more step. And of course, there are a lot of people who are keen on expanding physics to accommodate mind. They are not so keen on expanding it to accommodate spirit. For example, someone like Roger Penrose, he's not interested in paranormal phenomena or mystical experiences, as far as I know, at least. And so that's a much more, if you like, deeper paradigm shift. And I envisage that paradigm shift as coming later. I think it'll come in two steps. The first paradigm shift will go from matter to include mind. The next paradigm shift will include spirit. Of course, I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty confident about the first paradigm shift. I'm not quite so confident about the second paradigm shift, because quite a lot of the people who are, if you like, spiritual leaders, they don't like the idea that science is going to accommodate it, because they like to feel that, spirituality is distinct from science and that you should try and keep them separate. You can't reduce spirit, in a reductionist way to physics or anything like that. So I'm not so confident, but nevertheless, because of my interest in spirituality, and because of my friendship with various spiritual people, if you like, spiritual teachers, I feel that will be the next stage. But it is, I think, relevant to the question of the future of humanity, because when we talk about the future of humanity, we are not just talking about, what is humanity? What is important about humanity is not just the fact that we've got minds. I would say it's the fact that we've got spirit. And I don't necessarily mean, I'm not implying necessarily there's some, eternal soul or anything like that. But I'm just saying humanity is involved in a spiritual enterprise. And I won't try and spell out exactly what I mean by spirit, but you asked for the distinction between mind and spirit. I tend to think of it in terms of particular experiences. For example, if I have a telepathic experience, I think of that as a mental phenomena, which should be explained by this new paradigm. If I think about having a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience, I think of that as being a more spiritual experience. Or if I have a full-blown mystical experience, which I haven't had, that's clearly also spiritual. But the point to make is that actually there isn't a sharp division between mental, if you like, between psychic and spiritual experience, because there's a continuum. And you can't really say this is psychic and this is spiritual, because they all go together. For example, let's take a case of levitation. Let's say Teresa of Avila would have levitations, and from a psychical point of view, what's interesting is that she's levitating. She's apparently defying the laws of gravity. So that's interesting to, if you like, to a physicist. How is she overcoming the laws of gravity? But she's also having she's experiencing an ecstatic state. And so that is, if you like, a mystical, that is a religious issue. So in some sense, that's an example of a phenomenon which involves both mind and spirit. It's both psychical and mystical. And so my actual belief personally is there is no clear-cut division between mind and spirit. And that's one of my reasons for thinking that you have to expand your paradigm to include both mind and spirit. If you like, you've got normal mind, paranormal mind, and transpersonal mind. And whatever your final theory of physics is, it has to accommodate all of those. So I don't know how convinced you are by that, Bernard, but that's my own personal perspective.
Well, you're very much a continuum person, and that's the only way to think. Medicine has been remarkably categorical, trying to have diagnosis and fit people in. And that's been a squeeze in my professional life. And you are making the spiritual, mental part of a continuum, which I think is absolutely necessary. There are degrees of what we might call mental, being able to do mathematics, being able to talk with somebody about certain ideas, we'll call mental. But then when you start getting towards the mystical, telepathy could be considered mental, but it's remarkable, and it becomes transpersonal in a small way, in that you're transiting between people at a distance. Then you go to mystical experiences, and the remarkable thing I'd ask you to comment on, Bernard, is the large increase in mystical experiences led, I think, primarily by the increasing reports of near-death experiences, which have a mystical quality to them by going out and seeing the oneness and the love that's all around us, but also by the increased use of psychedelics in structured and unstructured ways. So these are current reports of increasing in what I think you are referring to as spiritual experiences. And that seems to me as a form of seriality in synchronicity terms of the increasing numbers of the same kinds of phenomenon begin to suggest a transformation for humanity. And I'm wondering what you think about that observation.
I think this is very important, Bernard. I mean, I think one has to distinguish between two aspects, though. The first is people becoming much more aware of these experiences, and therefore they're reported much more. You can talk about these experiences without being dismissed as crazy. And so that's one factor, which is a very positive development, that you can now talk about these phenomena. They're no longer taboo. And as you say, increasing number of people are having near-death experiences, which I would also regard very much as spiritual experiences, because they have spiritual implications. People who have near-death experiences, it affects them spiritually. So that is really important, that we're becoming more aware of, if you like, science also is becoming more aware of these phenomena and beginning to study them scientifically. But you're raising the other question. You're raising the question, are these phenomena becoming more frequent? Now, that's very interesting, because people often say that in some sense, humanity's consciousness is evolving spiritually in a collective sense. I mean, there's no doubt that individuals may have mystical experience, and individual people may become enlightened, or whatever phrase you want to use. But the question is humanity as a whole becoming more spiritual? Is humanity as a whole going through its elevated consciousness? Now, I'm not certain about this. I would certainly like to think the answer is yes. I'm not quite sure whether the evidence, though, is conclusive, because, as I said, it's a question of how you distinguish between people merely talking more about experiences and actually people having the experiences more. I do get the impression that people are having more of these experiences, but I'm not 100% certain about it. But this is important because, to me, the question of whether we're not really talking now about individuals, we're talking about humanity as a whole. We're saying, is humanity as a whole is it evolving spiritually? Is its consciousness evolving? In other words, are we becoming aware, if you like, of the planetary level of consciousness? I think that's really important, because if that's the case, that is going to be very relevant to the survival of humanity. I mean, we're all aware of the numerous ways in which we can get wiped out. I mean, there's no, you know, there's so many doomsday scenarios that one doesn't want to start getting on. I mean, all the climate problems, the problem of war, the problem of asteroids, the problem of viruses. There's so many ways we can be wiped out. Basically, there are far more ways to be wiped out than there are ways of surviving. Yeah, more ways of dying than of surviving. So in that sense, you might think the chances of survival are rather low. And especially because when you look at it, many of the dangers are associated with the negative aspects of humanity. I mean, warfare, greed, etc. Those are the environmental dangers, which are often a result of basically greed, people trying to make money and exploit the Earth's resources. That is where the danger lies. However, if it is true that if there is this evolving level of consciousness, that is going to counteract that effect. And actually, I keep talking about this post-materialist paradigm, which is going to accommodate mind and spirit. If this is going to come about, I think it has to imply that humanity will become more spiritual. And if it's going to become more spiritual, that therein lies our salvation, in the sense that if some of the dangers to humanity arise from the more selfish aspects of human nature, it seems to me that the chances for survival are going to be boosted by the more positive aspects of human nature, which we normally associate with,
let's assume
spirituality.
Let's assume that with your doubts already taken into consideration about the frequency of the increase.
Not doubts, uncertainty. I'm just not certain.
Uncertain. And well, you're a good scientist. Be uncertain, but let's now go with a little more certainty.
Okay.
And let's say that these mystical experiences are popping up a lot, partly because people go to the cardiac care unit and almost die, but they brought back, and that's been a critical reason why we see more reports of near-death experiences. People,
Indeed.
they were there before, but now people say I had a near-death experience just offhandedly in the ones I'm talking with. But let's say these are common. Certainly psychedelic use has been increased.
Yep.
Let's say, for the remainder of our discussion today, that this increase is happening, but it's only happening on a fraction of humanity. It's not a pervasive thing, and I doubt that it's going to be. There's too many people who are, for various reasons, not likely to have an NDE, or not likely to have a psychedelic experience, or not likely, some do, of having a spontaneous spiritual experience. Those happen as well. So let's say there's a minority of humanity experiencing these spiritual, mystical experiences. What implication does that have for the future of humanity?
Well, you see, it even if it's a small fraction, it still has enormous implications for humanity. I mean, after all, you just have to look at the great spiritual leaders, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, whatever. They only represent a tiny fraction of the population, and yet they have undoubtedly had a huge effect on humanity, even more than science. So there's no doubt about that. So I think the impact on society is not simply proportional to the number of people who have the experience. The number of people who are spiritually enlightened might be tiny. It might be 1 in a billion. What are there? There are 8 billion people in the world. But the people who have those spiritual experiences have a huge impact on society and always have done. And so even if it's only a tiny fraction of people who have these experiences, that doesn't mean it's a small impact. The impact is not just proportional to the number of people. But what is interesting, you refer to this, is that people, because of technological developments, resuscitation machines, more and more people are having near-death experiences. And therefore, the more people who do have these experiences, that is also going to affect humanity in a different way. So you've got two sorts of effects. You've got the effect of a few individuals who are affecting humanity as a whole. And then you've got the fact that maybe far more ordinary people are having these experiences. And that's another help. Both of these are important, but they help in different ways, it seems to me. But if you want to convince scientists, if you want to have a paradigm shift, I think it's going to become, if you like, a sociological change. I think it's going to be important that more people do have these experiences, and appreciate their reality. Now, that's not necessarily, though, going to be a good thing. I mean, for example, one of the implications of all this idea that consciousness is filtered through the brain rather than generated through the brain is that consciousness may survive death. So when my brain dies, my soul may still go on, or the other Bernard, your soul may still go on. And of course, that can have profound implications for the meaning of life, for how you live your life. Of course, most religious traditions have some view of what sort of existence you have when you die. You might go to heaven, you might go to hell, you might be reincarnated. But the point is, I would say that's one of the implications of this new paradigm, that consciousness may survive death. Now, is that good or bad? It can go either way. You see, you might say, well, it's good because you realize you're part of a bigger consciousness, etc., which is part of evolving spirituality. But on the other hand, it could have negative implications, because if you believe, if you believe their soul is going to survive, in a certain sense, it cheapens life. And you might think, well, it doesn't matter if I kill this guy, he's just going to be reincarnated, and it doesn't matter if I wipe out humanity because we'll all be reincarnated. So what I mean is, the example you've given is interesting in two ways. First of all, it shows how technology can actually drive spiritual evolution. Resuscitation gives people near-death experiences. But also, if we accept that consciousness survives death, does that cheapen life? There are billions of people in India who believe, 1 billion people in India who believe in reincarnation, but it doesn't make life any better. So what I'm saying is it works either way. So, I think that's. Obviously, I'm trying to stress the positive, but I'm also always trying to say that every paradigm shift has implications, and they're both positive and negative implications, and it's sort of up to us what we make of those implications.
It's up to us, and one of the things I keep hearing from you is the polarity that exists about almost anything we do, especially major things. And you're really good at, there's that, and then there's that, and then there's that. There's the opposite. And so I think we're coming to the end of our time together. So please comment on that, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Well, what I will do, I mean, let me just give, you're right, I always like to see the positives and the negative aspects of things. And I would, one thing I would like to mention, because I've become rather obsessed with this recently, is the role of AI. Okay. And as you know, AI is, and this is what the meeting in Australia was partly about, there are these incredible developments in AI which are affecting all of society. It's quite clear that these machines can now exceed human capability, in most mental aspects. You know, they can beat humans at chess, and they can think more rapidly. They can, you're all aware, you're completely aware of that. So AI is transforming society, and to me, AI is both a huge blessing and a huge curse. It can go either way. I'm so excited. I personally, this is a minority view, especially among spiritual people. I don't see why AI will not eventually develop consciousness. Because if you believe the brain is a filter of consciousness, I don't see any reason why consciousness should not be filtered through silicon rather than through biology. Because any physical system which is complex enough to have a model of the world and to have memories and things like that and to have intelligence basically could be a filter. And I don't see why eventually AI won't develop consciousness and or even develop all those aspects associated with consciousness or even souls. So that is not a majority view. As you know, there's the big polarity, those who believe they will always be purely mechanical machines and those who believe that they will become the next stage of evolution. I mean, of course, I don't know. But however, I'm betting they will at some point develop consciousness, and they've already passed the Turing test. So the question is that a good or a bad thing? Well, I can say why I think it's a good thing, first of all, because first of all, AI is going to be tremendously helpful it's going to be tremendously helpful even in physics, in coming to understand the laws of physics in the universe. It's going to be tremendously helpful in medical advances. One of the big problems at the moment is that such an exponentiation of knowledge, in science I'm talking about now, such a rapid advance of knowledge, nobody can possibly keep track of all the developments. You can only succeed in science by focusing on a narrower and narrower area, because otherwise you simply can't keep up with the literature. So the idea of the Renaissance man who's going to understand all of knowledge, that died 100 years ago. So the problem is, this is a bit of a crisis. No individual can basically understand all of the developments. We can't see the wood for the trees. So what's the solution? Well, it seems to me the only solution for that is AI, because AI has a far more pervasive knowledge, or is developing a far more pervasive knowledge than us, and it thinks far, far more quickly than us. It can do in 1 second what we would take months to do. I think I referred earlier to the fact there could be consciousness on many different timescales, and I don't see why there couldn't be AI computer consciousness on a timescale of a nanosecond, for example. We would never know. So I think that's really, I see that as being a positive development, because I think we're going to be able to use AI as a tool basically to understand the universe, because only AI is going to be able to do that. And in a certain sense, I think there's a link between the collective consciousness, the collective information, if you like, associated with AI, and the collective consciousness associated with collective experience. So I see that as a positive development. And indeed, I think, I'm fascinated in whether we're going to make contact with ET, extraterrestrial intelligence, because that's going to have a huge effect on the future of humanity. We haven't talked about that, but I mean, that could be I think that will have a big impact on the future of humanity, because that relates to these higher levels of consciousness, galactic level of consciousness. It's not inconceivable to me that the contact with ET will come through AI, that it's AI which is going to make the contact with ET rather than...
I've had that sense when working with AI myself.
Oh, great.
That there have been some ET moments that I think that's not coming from you as a thing created by Anthropic. This is like something else.
Oh, well,
So
that's great. I'm so pleased about that. So it can't be completely crazy if other people are saying it. But the point I also want to make to preserve the balance is that there's also no doubt that ET is a danger.
no,
Uh,
it's no doubt that it's a danger, and we don't have to do that right now because there are plenty of people who are talking about AI taking over in various ways, and
Exactly, and I
that's
think I find that that's a nightmare. You know, the idea of uploading your mind to the internet, the idea of you know living forever. I mean the it's
as,
rather the
as,
idea of basically humans being wiped out because one of the scenarios is that basically AI
it takes
ceases to
over.
be a servant, basically takes over, and that's the
Yeah,
end of humanity. So that's also one of the futures
it's
that we face. But
unfortunately that kind of imagery is sometimes self-fulfilling that when we imagine things. So that's why I'm so interested in creating a positive view of humanity because there's so many negative views being promulgated. You look at YouTube videos, and most of them a future of humanity and some malevolent force, often AI, takes over. But I'll need to be able to stop here
oh, okay. I was
as
just going to say that what we call negative, some people see as positive. That's the problem. So, you
the,
know,
uh,
with
the
all this
remarkable,
emphasis on transhumanism. Yeah.
yes, the transhumanism idea. But that's we could get into that one also, which Scientific and Medical Network has spent some good time with. We could do that. There's so much more we could talk about, but it's time to put this party to bed now and to wish Bernard adieu and thank you very much for highly stimulating. I mean, you got a lot of good ideas in there, and I'm glad that I've been able to understand them better this third time that you and I have talked in this way. So,
Well,
uh,
and I do hope, Bernard, that my message, I've tried to present both sides of the coin, but I do hope that my message is primarily actually positive. Because you said it very well. I mean, by thinking about the positive and the negatives, it tends to generate those
that's right.
outcomes. So it's really important to be thinking about the positives. And I am positive. I think that uh, I think I think that AI and ET, I think they're going to play a crucial role in the survival of humanity.
Well, Let's leave it at that. And I'm so glad to hear your positive view of what AI can do, because it's very important, and there's no reason why silicone can't do what our carbon-based system does, as I've suggested to myself and others. So we'll leave it there, and perhaps we will have this conversation as a continuation as I continue to develop my ideas about the future of humanity, and I'm able to bounce them off of the cosmologist way of thinking.
Well, I look forward to another conversation, say in 100 years, Bernard, and then we'll see what the future is, perhaps.
Well, it's going to be faster than that, baby. It's going to be faster than that.
I know. Mm.
Well, thanks again, Bernard, for being part of this wonderful discussion with me.
Thank you, Bernard. Bye bye.